Only real family belongs in the living room. My daughter-in-law said it like she was pointing out the weather, calm, effortless, as if she hadn't just erased me from my own life. Then she opened the narrow white door beside the hallway and gave me a small, polite gesture inside. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply stepped into the laundry room, the scent of detergent and fabric softener wrapping around me like something sterile and unfamiliar, and I heard the door close behind me with a soft click that felt louder than any slam. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the edge of the washing machine, listening. Through the thin wall, I could hear the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of chairs, the careful clearing of a throat. The will reading had begun without me. I smoothed down the front of my navy dress, the one Daniel used to say made me look elegant, Mom, back when he still looked at me like I mattered. I had pressed it that morning with slow, deliberate care, the same way I had done for every important family moment for the past 40 years. Funerals, holidays, graduations. I had always shown up prepared, composed, present. Today was supposed to be no different. Today was supposed to be about honoring my husband, Thomas Collins. 48 years of marriage, reduced now to a stack of papers and a room full of people deciding what he had left behind. I had imagined sitting in the living room, perhaps holding onto the arm of the leather chair he loved, listening as Mr. Green read the words Thomas had carefully chosen. I thought I would hear his voice in those words. I thought I would feel, if only for a moment, that he was still protecting me. Instead, I was standing between a dryer that hummed faintly and a shelf lined with neatly folded towels that I had once arranged myself. Funny how quickly a place can stop feeling like yours. I leaned slightly toward the door, not enough to be obvious, just enough to catch a fragment of conversation. Ashley's voice carried clearly, smooth, and controlled, the way it always was when she wanted something to sound reasonable. We should keep things efficient, she said. No need to complicate matters. Efficient. That was the word she used when she replaced the family dinner with catered meals. When she changed the locks for security. When she told Daniel it would be better if I stopped coming over unannounced, even though I had never needed an invitation before. I closed my eyes for a second, just long enough to steady myself. I had seen this coming. Not this exact moment, not the quiet exile into a laundry room, but the shift. The way conversations would stop when I entered. The way decisions were made and then presented to me as if they were already final. The way Daniel had begun to avoid my eyes, as if looking at me too long might force him to choose something he didn't want to face. Still, there was something almost impressive about the precision of it all. Ashley hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't caused a scene. She had simply redirected me, like moving a misplaced object out of sight before guests arrived. I glanced around the small room again, taking in every detail as if committing it to memory. The faint scratch on the dryer door, the basket of unmatched socks, the overhead light that flickered once before settling into a steady glow. This was where I had been placed. This was where I was expected to stay. And for a moment, I let them believe that I would. I rested my hand more firmly on the washing machine and allowed a small, almost invisible smile to touch my lips. Not because I found any of this amusing, but because I finally understood something that had been forming quietly beneath the surface for months. They thought they had removed me from the story. They thought closing that door had simplified everything. What they didn't know, what Ashley couldn't possibly have known when she guided me in here with that calm, practiced gesture, was that Thomas had never been a man who left things simple. I could hear Mr. Green now, his voice measured, professional, beginning the formal reading. Papers shifted. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. The room I was not allowed to enter was moving forward without me, just as they had planned. I tilted my head slightly, listening more carefully now, not with desperation, but with patience. Because for the first time since I had stepped into that house that morning, I wasn't wondering why this was happening. I already knew. And more importantly, I knew something else. Something they had overlooked. Something that had been written down, signed, and sealed long before Ashley ever decided who counted as real family. I exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the quiet hum of the machines, and straightened my shoulders. Let them sit comfortably in that living room. Let them believe the story was already decided. After all, the reading had only just begun. I stayed where I was, letting the quiet settle into something almost steady, almost familiar, The way silence used to feel late at night when Thomas would fall asleep in his chair and the whole house would breathe more slowly. But this was different. This silence did not belong to me. It pressed in from all sides, shaped by walls that no longer recognized me as the woman who had chosen their paint colors, who had measured their curtains, who had stood in this very laundry room, folding tiny shirts when Daniel was still small enough to believe I could fix anything. I reached out and lightly touched the top of the dryer, remembering how Thomas used to complain about its rattling noise, how he said we should replace it even though it still worked just fine, and I had laughed and told him we would keep it until it gave up on us first. And now here it was, still humming, still reliable, still part of a home that was quietly being taken away from me piece by piece without a single raised voice. From the other side of the door, Mr. Green's voice became clearer, steady, and professional, each word carefully pronounced as if he understood that what he was reading would shape more than just property lines. It would define relationships, confirm loyalties, expose truths that had been carefully hidden beneath polite smiles and rehearsed conversations. I heard the shuffle of papers again, followed by a pause. The kind that makes people sit up straighter, the kind that signals something important is about to be said. And for a brief moment, I imagined the room. The way Ashley would be sitting upright with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression composed but alert, her eyes always calculating, always one step ahead, and Daniel beside her, slightly tense, his shoulders tight, his gaze fixed somewhere safe, anywhere but on the empty space where I should have been sitting. It had not always been like this. I reminded myself, not because I needed comfort, but because I needed clarity, because understanding how something changes is the only way to understand why it changes. And I could still remember the first time Ashley came into our lives, standing at the front door with that bright, effortless smile, holding a small box of pastries as if she had stepped straight out of a magazine advertisement for the perfect future daughter-in-law. Polite, attentive, careful with her words, the kind of young woman who made you feel seen in the best possible way. And I had welcomed her, truly welcomed her, not out of obligation, but out of hope, because I believed that loving my son meant making room for the person he chose to love. I had offered her recipes, stories, space, even pieces of myself that I had spent decades shaping into something stable and dependable. And for a while, she had accepted all of it with gratitude that felt genuine. But gratitude, I would later learn, can be a temporary performance, something that fades once its purpose has been served. The first change had been so small I almost missed it, a suggestion about rearranging the living room furniture, presented as a way to modernize the space. And I had agreed, because it seemed harmless, because change is natural, because I did not yet understand that this was not about furniture, it was about positioning, about shifting the center of the home, about slowly rewriting who belonged where. After that came the conversations I was not included in, the decisions that were already made before they reached me, the subtle corrections in tone when I spoke about something that used to be mine to decide, and each time I told myself it was nothing, that families evolve, that roles change, that I needed to adapt, because that is what I had always done. I had adapted through every stage of life, through every challenge, through every quiet sacrifice. That never needed to be announced because it was simply expected. But standing here now, listening to my husband's will being read from behind a closed door, I could finally see the pattern for what it was, not a series of small, disconnected moments, but a deliberate progression, a careful narrowing of my place in a life I had built from the ground up. Mr. Green cleared his throat again, and I heard him say Thomas's full name, slow and deliberate, and something in my chest tightened, not from pain, but from recognition. Because Thomas had never rushed anything important. He believed that the weight of a decision deserved time, deserved attention, deserved to be heard fully, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable, that whatever he had left behind was not as simple as Ashley wanted it to be, not as clean, not as efficient. I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, and straightened my back, my reflection faintly visible in the small glass panel of the dryer door. An older woman, yes, but not a fragile one, not a forgotten one, and certainly not the kind of woman who disappears just because someone quietly closes a door. I had spent a lifetime learning when to speak and when to wait, when to step forward and when to let others reveal themselves. And as I listened to the Careful unfolding of Thomas's final words, I understood that this moment, this quiet, controlled pause, was not an ending. It was simply the space before everything changed. Mr. Green's voice slowed slightly, the way it does when a sentence carries more weight than the others. And even through the wall, I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tightening of attention, the kind that makes people stop fidgeting and start listening with intent. I imagined Ashley straightening just a little more, her fingers resting lightly against her knee, her expression composed but alert, always alert, because she never missed an opportunity to secure what she believed was already hers, and Daniel beside her, quiet, uncertain, caught between habit and hesitation, a man who had learned over time that silence was easier than confrontation, even when that silence cost more than he realized. I closed my eyes and let the sound of Thomas's name settle into me, not as a memory of loss, but as a reminder of who he had always been, a man who noticed details others overlooked, a man who believed that fairness was not something you talked about, it was something you built, carefully, quietly, and then protected with everything you had. There was a pause, longer this time, followed by the soft sound of paper being turned, and then Mr. Green spoke again, his tone unchanged but his pace deliberate, as if he understood that what came next needed to be heard clearly, without interruption, without assumption, and I leaned slightly closer to the door, not out of desperation, but out of focus, the kind of attention that comes when you already know the truth is about to surface and you simply need to hear it spoken aloud. I thought back to a conversation Thomas and I had shared not long before he passed, one of those quiet evenings when the house felt still and the world outside seemed far away. He had been sitting in his chair, the same chair that was now likely occupied by someone else, and he had looked at me with that steady, knowing expression that always meant he had already made a decision, even if he had not said it yet. And he had asked me a simple question, whether I trusted that things would be handled properly when he was gone. And I had answered without hesitation, because I trusted him. Because I believed that the life we had built together could not be undone by something as ordinary as paperwork. Now, standing in this narrow room, I understood that he had not been asking about paperwork at all. He had been asking if I trusted him to see what others might try to hide, if I trusted him to protect me in ways that did not need to be obvious until the moment came. On the other side of the door, a chair shifted abruptly, followed by a brief silence that felt heavier than anything before it, and then Ashley's voice, controlled but edged with something sharper, something less certain. "I am sorry. Could you clarify that section?" she asked, her tone polite but strained, and I felt a small, quiet certainty settle deeper into my chest, because Ashley only asked questions when something did not align with her expectations, when something moved outside the plan she had already constructed in her mind. Mr. Green responded calmly, repeating the line, slower this time, each word placed carefully, and although I could not hear every syllable clearly through the wall, I did not need to, because I recognized the rhythm of it, the structure of a condition, not a simple distribution, not a straightforward transfer, but something layered, something that required more than assumption to understand. I let out a slow breath, my hand resting lightly against the door now, not pushing, not knocking, just present, because I could feel the shift happening on the other side, the careful confidence beginning to unravel, the quiet realization that things were not as simple as they had been presented to me, and I wondered if Ashley was still sitting perfectly composed, or if there was now the slightest tension in her posture, the smallest crack in the calm certainty she had worn like a second skin. Daniel spoke then, his voice lower, uncertain, asking something I could not fully make out, and there was a pause before Mr. Green answered, longer this time, as if he were choosing his words with even greater care, and I could almost see Daniel's expression in that moment, the confusion, the slow recognition that something important had been overlooked, something that should have been questioned earlier but was not, because it had been easier to accept the version of events that required the least resistance. I opened my eyes and looked around the laundry room once more, but this time it felt different, not smaller, not confining, just temporary, like a place you pass through on the way to somewhere else, and I straightened my shoulders again, the fabric of my dress settling smoothly, the same way it had that morning when I had stood in front of the mirror and prepared myself for a day that was supposed to be about remembrance, not revelation. The voices beyond the door had changed now, no longer smooth and controlled, but edged with something uncertain, something searching, and I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition, because I understood now that the story they had tried to contain was beginning to expand beyond their control, and I had not even opened the door yet. I did not move right away, even as the voices beyond the door grew tighter, more fragmented, as if each word now required careful placement instead of flowing naturally the way they had only minutes before, because I understood something they did not, that rushing into a moment before it fully reveals itself can weaken its impact, and I had waited long enough in my life to recognize when patience was not weakness, but preparation. I let my hand rest against the door, feeling the faint vibration of voices passing through it, and I listened more closely now, not for every word, but for the spaces between them, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the subtle shift in control that had once belonged entirely to Ashley and now seemed to be slipping, piece by piece, into something far less certain. Mr. Green's voice remained steady, but there was a firmness to it now, a quiet insistence that suggested he was no longer simply reading. He was clarifying, reinforcing, making sure that what had been written could not be misunderstood or conveniently ignored, and I could almost picture the document in his hands, pages aligned, language precise, the kind of legal structure Thomas would have insisted on, not because he distrusted people, but because he understood them, understood how easily intentions could be reshaped when no one was there to hold them in place. I thought again of the night he had asked me that question, whether I trusted that things would be handled properly, and I remembered the way he had nodded after I answered, not with relief, but with quiet confirmation, as if my trust had simply aligned with something he had already ensured. On the other side of the door, Ashley spoke again, her tone still controlled but no longer effortless. "That does not seem necessary," she said, and there it was. The first crack that could not be smoothed over with polite language, the first sign that what she had expected to unfold was no longer unfolding the way she had planned, and I could almost see the slight tightening around her eyes, the careful recalibration of her expression as she tried to regain ground she had already begun to lose. Daniel said something next, his voice lower, uncertain, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to feel the echo of who he used to be, the boy who once asked questions freely, who once trusted that answers would come without conditions, and I wondered if, in this moment, he was beginning to see something he had not allowed himself to see before, something that had been right in front of him all along. I straightened my shoulders once more, the familiar weight of composure settling into place, not as a mask, but as something far more grounded, something earned over years of learning when to speak and when to remain still, and I glanced at the small clock mounted above the shelf, its quiet ticking marking time that no longer felt like it was moving against me, but with me, each second bringing the room beyond that door closer to a realization they could not avoid. I remembered the early days of our marriage, when Thomas and I had built everything from nothing, counting every dollar, making careful decisions, trusting each other completely because we had no one else to rely on. And I remembered how he would double-check everything, not out of fear, but out of respect for what we were building, because he believed that anything worth having was worth protecting properly, and that belief had never left him, not even in his final days. The voices beyond the door rose slightly, not loud, but edged with urgency now, and I could hear the subtle shift in tone as Mr. Green continued. His words no longer met with quiet acceptance, but with interruption, with questions that carried a hint of disbelief. And I knew without needing to hear every detail that the structure of Thomas's will was revealing itself fully now, not as a simple transfer of ownership, but as something conditional, something deliberate, something that required more than assumption to navigate. I placed my hand on the doorknob, not turning it yet, just resting there, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the certainty that had settled within me, because this moment was no longer about being excluded. It was about timing, about understanding exactly when to step forward so that what needed to be seen could no longer be denied. Ashley's voice came again, sharper this time despite her effort to keep it composed. "I think there may be some confusion," she said, and I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but out of recognition. Because confusion is what people call it when the version of reality they have relied on begins to unravel, when the outcome they expected no longer fits the facts placed in front of them. I turned the handle slowly, not enough to open the door, just enough to feel the mechanism shift, a quiet signal to myself that the moment I had been waiting for was no longer ahead of me. It was here, unfolding just beyond a thin barrier that had already lost its meaning. And I took a steady breath, the kind that settles everything into place, because I knew that when I stepped back into that room, I would not be returning as someone who had been set aside. I would be returning as someone they had failed to account for, and that difference would change everything. I turned the handle the rest of the way and opened the door without hurry, the hinges making only the faintest sound as the light from the hallway slipped into the narrow room behind me. And for a brief second I remained where I was, not stepping forward yet, allowing the shift in presence to register before I even spoke, because silence, when used properly, has a way of announcing you more clearly than words ever could. The living room fell still almost immediately, the quiet no longer controlled or composed, but startled, uneven, as if the rhythm of the moment had been interrupted in a way no one had prepared for. And I could see them now, exactly as I had imagined. Ashley sitting upright on the edge of the sofa, her posture precise but her expression no longer entirely smooth. Daniel beside her, his shoulders slightly drawn in, his eyes flickering toward me before quickly shifting away again. And Mr. Green standing near the fireplace, the document still in his hands, his gaze steady, not surprised, not unsettled, simply observant. I stepped fully into the room then, closing the door gently behind me, not as a statement, not as a gesture, just as something natural, as if I had always belonged in this space, as if there had never been a question about where I should stand. And I moved toward the armchair near the window, the one Thomas had always preferred in the afternoons, its leather worn just enough to hold the shape of familiarity, and I rested my hand lightly on its back before taking my seat, smoothing my dress once more as I settled in, my movements calm, deliberate, unhurried. No one spoke at first, and I let that silence remain, not rushing to fill it, not offering explanations or questions, because I understood that whatever needed to be said would reveal itself without my prompting. And it was Ashley who broke it, her voice measured, carefully composed. "We were just about to continue," she said, her tone polite but edged with something firmer, something defensive, and I met her gaze evenly, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. "Please," I replied quietly, my voice steady, as if I had never been absent at all, as if this moment were simply a continuation rather than a disruption. And Mr. Green gave a small nod before returning his attention to the document, his voice resuming with that same calm precision. But now every word seemed to carry a different weight, not just because of what was written, but because of who was now in the room to hear it. I listened carefully as he continued, the structure of the will unfolding more clearly with each sentence, and I could feel the subtle tension building again. But this time it was different, no longer directed outward, no longer controlled by Ashley's quiet authority, but shifting inward, turning uncertain, as if the foundation beneath her expectations had begun to move. Daniel shifted, slightly in his seat, his hands clasped together in a way I recognized from years ago, a small sign of discomfort he had never quite outgrown, and I wondered if he was beginning to understand that the version of events he had accepted so easily was incomplete, that something important had been left unexamined, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. Ashley remained still, but there was a sharpness now in the way she held her posture, a subtle rigidity that had not been there before, and when Mr. Green reached another section, she leaned forward just slightly, as if trying to stay ahead of what was coming, as if control could be regained through attention alone, as outlined. Mr. Green continued, his tone unchanged. "The primary residence and associated assets are subject to the conditions specified herein." And there was that word again, conditions, spoken clearly, deliberately, leaving no room for interpretation. And I saw the smallest flicker cross Ashley's face, quickly contained, quickly replaced, but present all the same. "What conditions?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter than before, but more direct, and Mr. Green paused, just long enough to acknowledge the question before continuing, reading the language exactly as it had been written. each clause precise, each requirement unmistakable, and as he spoke, the room seemed to shift again, not physically, but in understanding, in alignment, in the quiet realization that what had been assumed to be simple was anything but. I folded my hands in my lap, listening without interruption, without reaction, because this was not a moment that required display, it required presence, and I could feel it now, the balance changing, the certainty that had once filled this room beginning to dissolve into something far less stable, far less predictable. Ashley exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then spoke again. Her voice still controlled, but no longer effortless. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, and I turned my head slightly toward her, not sharply, not suddenly, just enough to meet her eyes, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I allowed myself to speak with just a touch more clarity, not louder, not stronger, simply more defined. No, I said calmly, my gaze steady. There is no misunderstanding. And then I fell silent again, letting the weight of that settle where it needed to. Because some truths do not need to be explained, they only need to be heard at the right moment. And I had chosen mine carefully. Mr. Green did not pause after my words, not even for a second. And that was what made the moment settle more deeply than anything else, because he did not treat what I said as an interruption. He treated it as confirmation, and he continued reading with the same steady cadence, as if the document itself had already anticipated this exact point in time, as if every line had been written with the understanding that it would need to stand firm against doubt, against resistance, against the quiet attempts to reshape it into something more convenient. The conditions outlined are binding, he said clearly, his voice even, measured, leaving no space for interpretation, and I saw Daniel shift again, his brow tightening slightly as he leaned forward, not out of defiance, but out of the need to understand something that no longer fit the narrative he had accepted, while Ashley remained still, but the stillness had changed, no longer composed, but controlled, held in place with effort rather than ease. I rested back into the chair, my posture relaxed, my hands folded loosely in my lap, and I listened as the structure of the will unfolded further, each clause building upon the last, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just precise, deliberate, the way Thomas had always approached anything that mattered. And I could feel it now, not as tension, but as clarity, the kind that settles in slowly and then refuses to leave. In order to retain full ownership of the primary residence, Mr. Green continued, the beneficiary must meet all specified conditions without exception. And Daniel's voice came again, more direct this time. What conditions? He asked, and there was no frustration in it, only confusion, the kind that comes when something simple becomes complicated in a way you cannot immediately resolve. Mr. Green turned a page carefully, the soft sound of paper shifting filling the brief silence before he read the next section, and I watched Ashley closely, not because I needed to, but because I understood that people reveal more in what they try to hide than in what they show. And there it was again, just for a moment, a flicker of calculation, a rapid adjustment, as if she were already searching for a way to navigate what she had not expected. The beneficiary must ensure that Margaret Collins retains full residential rights to the property. Mr. Green read, each word placed with quiet precision, including but not limited to unrestricted access, occupancy, and decision-making authority regarding the use and maintenance of the home. And the room seemed to still in a different way now, not surprised, not startled, but absorbing, processing, adjusting. Daniel looked toward me then, his expression uncertain, searching, as if trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of him with the assumptions he had allowed to shape his understanding, and I met his gaze calmly, not accusing, not questioning, simply present, because this was not a moment for confrontation, it was a moment for recognition. Ashley spoke again, but the smoothness was gone now, replaced with something tighter, more deliberate. That is not how we discussed it, she said, her tone still controlled, but no longer effortless, and Mr. Green did not react to her statement. He did not correct her, did not challenge her. He simply continued, because what had been written did not require defense, it required only to be read. Failure to comply with these conditions, he went on, will result in the immediate transfer of all associated assets to the designated alternate beneficiary. And there it was, the line that shifted everything from possibility to consequence, from assumption to reality, and I saw the change ripple through the room, subtle but unmistakable. The way certainty begins to dissolve when it is no longer supported by fact. Daniel sat back slightly, his hands no longer clasped, his posture no longer fixed, as if something had loosened, something he had not realized was holding him in place. And Ashley's expression held for a moment longer before tightening, just enough to reveal what she had been working to conceal. Not panic, not anger, but calculation under pressure, the kind that comes when control is no longer guaranteed. I remained where I was, steady, composed, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was not about proving anything. It was about allowing the truth to take its proper shape in the space between us. And I knew Thomas had understood this when he wrote those words, had known exactly how they would land, exactly how they would shift the balance in a room where someone might try to quietly rearrange what did not belong to them. Mr. Green lowered the page slightly, his eyes moving across the document one last time before he looked up, not at Ashley, not at Daniel, but at me, just briefly, a simple acknowledgement, nothing more, and I returned it with a small, almost imperceptible nod, because no further explanation was needed, not from him, not from me, not anymore. And in that quiet exchange, the room seemed to settle into a new understanding, one that could not be redirected or ignored, one that had been written long before anyone thought to question it. No one spoke immediately after Mr. Green finished that section, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy with understanding, the kind that settles in slowly and then refuses to be ignored. And I could see it in Daniel's face first, the way his expression shifted from confusion into something more grounded, more aware, as if he were finally seeing the structure beneath everything that had been happening. The quiet shifts, the decisions made without question, the assumptions he had accepted because they required less effort than looking deeper. Ashley did not move at first, but her stillness was no longer composed. It was held, controlled, maintained with visible effort, and when she finally spoke again, her voice was lower, more measured, but no longer smooth. There must be some flexibility in how that is interpreted, she said, choosing her words carefully, as if precision might reshape what had already been clearly defined, and Mr. Green responded without hesitation, his tone unchanged. The language is explicit, he said, and there was no emphasis, no added weight, just a simple statement of fact, the kind that does not invite negotiation. I watched Ashley for a moment longer, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, simply with recognition, because I understood what she was doing. Searching for space where none had been left, trying to find an angle that would allow her to maintain the position she had already claimed. But Thomas had never been a man who left angles open when something mattered, and I could feel that certainty now, steady, unshaken, present in every word that had been read. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands no longer clasped but open, as if he were trying to hold on to something that had only just come into focus. "So what does that mean exactly?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice now, less defensive, more direct, the kind of tone he used when he was younger, when he still believed that asking the right question would lead to a clear answer. Mr. Green turned his attention toward him, not shifting his posture, not changing his tone, just redirecting his focus. "It means that your mother's position in this home is permanent and protected," he said, each word clear, deliberate, and any decisions regarding the property must include her full consent. And I saw Daniel absorb that, not quickly, not easily, but fully, the way understanding sometimes takes a moment to settle into place. Ashley exhaled quietly, the sound controlled but audible, and for the first time since I had entered the room, she did not speak immediately. She did not attempt to redirect or reframe. She simply sat there, processing, recalculating, and I knew that was the moment the balance had truly shifted. Not when the words were read, but when they were understood. I adjusted my position slightly in the chair, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, the same small movement I had made countless times in this room over the years, and I let my gaze move briefly across the familiar space, the framed photographs on the wall, the table near the window, the subtle details that had once been mine to arrange without question. and I realized that nothing about them had changed, only the assumptions around them had. There is also the matter of compliance, Mr. Green continued, his voice steady as he turned another page, and the room seemed to tighten again, not with confusion this time, but with anticipation, because now they understood that each section carried weight, each line had consequence. Ashley straightened slightly, her composure returning in fragments, not fully restored, but carefully reconstructed. What happens if the conditions are not met? She asked, and there was no softness left in her tone now, only precision, only intent, and Mr. Green answered without pause. Then the estate transfers in full to the alternate beneficiary as specified, and the clarity of that statement settled into the room with quiet finality. Daniel looked between us then, first at Mr. Green, then at Ashley, and finally at me, his gaze lingering just a moment longer this time, as if he were trying to bridge the distance that had been quietly growing for years, and I met his eyes again, calm, steady, offering nothing more than presence, because this was not a moment that could be forced into resolution. It was a moment that needed to be seen for what it was. Ashley turned slightly in her seat, her attention shifting back toward Mr. Green. But the certainty that had once defined her posture was gone, replaced with something more cautious, more measured. And I understood that this was not the end of anything, not yet. But it was the point where the narrative she had constructed could no longer move forward without resistance. I rested my hands gently against the armrests of the chair, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingers, grounding myself in the quiet stability of something that had always been mine, and I allowed a small, almost imperceptible breath to pass, not of relief, not of triumph, but of recognition, because I could see it clearly now, the line that had been drawn long before today, the one that separated assumption from reality, and I had just stepped fully onto the side that could not be moved. The room did not return to what it had been before, even after the words settled, even after the initial reaction passed, because once something is understood, it cannot be undone, and I could see that understanding taking shape in the small details, in the way Daniel no longer avoided looking at me, in the way Ashley's posture remained upright but no longer effortless, as if maintaining control now required more energy than it had before. Mr. Green adjusted the document slightly in his hands, not as a pause, but as a continuation, because there was still more to be read, and I knew that whatever came next would not soften what had already been established. It would reinforce it, layer it, make it impossible to dismiss as a misunderstanding or an oversight. There is an additional provision, he said, his voice steady, and that single sentence shifted the air in the room again, not sharply, but enough to draw every ounce of attention back to him. And I watched Ashley carefully, the way her eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, the kind that comes when someone realizes there is still more they do not know. Daniel leaned back slowly this time, not retreating, but absorbing, his gaze moving between Mr. Green and the document as if trying to anticipate what would be said before it was spoken, and I remained where I was, still, composed, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. Because this was no longer about reacting, it was about witnessing something that had already been set into motion long before any of us sat in this room. In the event of dispute or obstruction, Mr. Green continued, all decision-making authority regarding the estate defaults to Margaret Collins as sole acting executor. And there it was, not just protection, but control, not just presence, but authority, written plainly, without decoration, without ambiguity, and I felt the weight of that settle into place, not as something new, but as something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Ashley's composure held for a fraction longer before shifting, not breaking, but tightening, her fingers pressing lightly against the arm of the sofa as if grounding herself, and when she spoke, her voice was still measured, but the effort behind it was no longer hidden. That was not communicated, she said, choosing each word with care, and Mr. Green met that statement with the same calm precision he had maintained throughout. All provisions are contained within the document, he replied, and there was no room in that response for interpretation, no opening for negotiation, only fact. Daniel looked toward me again, more directly this time, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not just confusion, but recognition, the slow realization that the structure he had relied on was incomplete, that there were elements he had not been invited to question, and I held his gaze briefly, not to challenge him, not to demand anything, but to allow that recognition to exist. Without interference, I thought back again to Thomas, not as a memory of loss, but as a presence that had shaped this moment with careful intention, the way he had always approached anything that mattered, not loudly, not forcefully, but thoroughly, ensuring that what needed to stand would stand, regardless of who might try to shift it later. This includes full oversight of financial distributions, property decisions, and any modifications to the estate. Mr. Green continued, his voice unchanged, and the finality of it settled into the room with quiet certainty, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just complete. Ashley exhaled slowly, her shoulders remaining straight, her expression composed, but there was no longer the same certainty in her stillness, only calculation, only adjustment, and I understood that this was the point where control had fully shifted, not in appearance, not in volume, but in structure, in authority, in the quiet framework that determined what could and could not be changed. Daniel's hands rested open now, no longer tense, no longer held together, and he glanced briefly at Ashley before looking back at Mr. Green, as if weighing something, as if beginning to understand that the path forward would not be as simple as it had once seemed. I allowed myself a small breath, steady and controlled, not out of relief, but out of clarity, because I could feel it now, the full shape of what Thomas had done, not just protecting me, but positioning me, ensuring that I would not need to argue, would not need to fight, would not need to prove anything beyond what had already been written. The room remained quiet for a moment longer, not empty, but settled into a new understanding, one that could not be undone by tone or suggestion, and I sat there, still, composed, present, knowing that everything that had been quietly taken from me had just as quietly been returned, not through confrontation, not through resistance, but through something far more enduring, something that had been prepared long before anyone thought to question it. No one reached for the document after that, and for the first time since we had gathered in that room, there was no urgency to move forward, no quiet push to control what came next, only a stillness that felt settled, complete, as if the outcome no longer needed to be guided because it had already taken its proper place. Mr. Green lowered the final page slightly, his posture unchanged, his expression neutral, but there was a subtle finality in the way he held the document, not as something still in motion, but as something concluded, and he gave a small nod, not directed at anyone in particular, but marking the end of what had been written and read exactly as intended. Ashley remained seated, her posture still upright, still composed, but the effort behind it was now visible in the smallest ways, in the way her fingers rested too precisely against the arm of the sofa, in the slight pause before each breath, as if she were recalibrating not just her next words, but her entire understanding of the situation she believed she had already secured, and yet she said nothing, not immediately, not this time, because there are moments when speaking too quickly reveals more than silence ever could. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, his movements no longer restrained, no longer uncertain, but thoughtful, as if something had finally settled into place within him, something that required more than a quick response, more than a simple question. And when he looked at me again, there was no avoidance in his gaze, no hesitation, only a quiet recognition that did not need to be explained aloud. I remained where I was, my hands resting lightly on the armrests of the chair, my posture steady, not rigid, not defensive, simply present, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to claim. Everything that needed to be established had already been written long before this moment, and had now been heard exactly as it was meant to be. The room itself felt different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the assumptions that once shaped it were no longer holding it in place. The invisible structure that had quietly pushed me aside had been replaced with something far more grounded, something that could not be adjusted or reinterpreted through tone or suggestion. Ashley finally spoke, but her voice had changed, not in volume, not in clarity, but in certainty, or rather in the absence of it. "We will need time to review this," she said, her words measured, careful, and Mr. Green inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without altering the fact of what had already been established, because review does not change what is written, it only confirms it. Daniel did not speak, not yet, but I could see the shift in him more clearly now, the way his posture had relaxed, the way his shoulders no longer held that quiet tension, and I wondered if he was beginning to understand not just what had been decided, but why, not just the outcome, but the intention behind it. I turned my gaze briefly toward the window, the late afternoon light filtering through the glass in the same quiet way it always had, unchanged, steady, unaffected by the dynamics within the room, and I realized that nothing essential had ever been taken from me, only temporarily obscured, shifted out of view by people who mistook silence for absence, and I had allowed that, for a time, because I believed that peace was maintained through patience, through stepping back, through trusting that understanding would come on its own. But understanding does not always arrive without structure, and Thomas had known that, had anticipated the exact moment when patience alone would no longer be enough, when clarity would need to be written, defined, protected in a way that could not be undone by interpretation. I rose slowly from the chair, not abruptly, not with emphasis, just a natural movement, and the room seemed to register it immediately, not with alarm, but with attention, the kind that follows when something has already shifted and everyone present knows it, even if no one says it aloud. I smoothed my dress once more, the fabric settling neatly into place, and I looked at Ashley for a brief moment, not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with quiet acknowledgement, because there was no need to revisit what had already been revealed, no need to restate what had already been understood. Then I turned slightly toward Daniel, my expression steady, composed, and for the first time that day, I allowed my voice to carry just enough weight to mark the moment without overwhelming it. Your father was very thorough, I said, and there was no emphasis, no edge, just a simple statement of truth, and I let it rest there, because it was enough, more than enough. I moved toward the door then, not leaving, not retreating, just crossing the room with the same calm presence I had carried since the moment I stepped back into it. And as I passed the place where I had once been directed elsewhere, I did not look back, because I no longer needed to. The door that had been closed on me earlier no longer held any meaning, and I understood with quiet certainty that they had not removed me from anything at all. They had only revealed exactly where I had always stood, and exactly where I would remain.